Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar for today. The topic that we are going to be covering is moral dilemmas and moral injury. Okay, this has been presented by the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. My name is Emily Kosick, and I'm the Knowledge Manager at CIPSRT. Today, we have a presentation and panel discussion, followed by a question and answer period. I encourage you to send your questions for the panel and presenters through the questions box throughout the presentation. Now, I'm going to introduce our panelists and presenters. First, we have Robert Stewart, who is the Director of Emergency Communication for the City of Brandon. Robert, if you want to just pop on for a second and wave to everybody so they know who you are, that would be great.
Hi, everybody.
Perfect. Next, we have Natalie Dufries-Meek, who is the Director of Security Operations at Corrections Canada. She is on the phone with us today, so if you want to say hi, Natalie.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Bonjour tout le monde.
And then we have our presenters. First of all, Lieutenant Colonel retired Dr. Alexandra Hubert. She's the Chief of Psychiatry for Veterans Affairs Canada, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Ottawa, and the Chair of CIPSRT's COVID-19 Task Force.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here today.
Lastly, we have Dr. Suzette Bramall-Phillips. She is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine and Neuroscience and Mental Health Institute. She's the Director of Highmark Heroes in Mind Advocacy and Research Consortium, and she's from the University of Alberta. So I'm going to hand it over to our presenters now, who are going to go ahead with their presentation.
Okay, so thank you, Emily. And to start, as Emily explained, our presentation is actually the first of two presentations happening this week on our virtual town hall series on moral injury. This one is going to look at moral injury and moral dilemmas. And there is a follow-up on Thursday, which will really continue on past where we end today. The next slide is, if you want to choose, right. So this is basically the précis, the summary that was on the website on what we're going to be covering today. And next slide. Okay, so this disclaimer, basically, this explains that the information that we're giving you today, we may in fact end up revising tomorrow or sometime in the future based on the new information that comes forward, because of course we're in this situation right now, which is ever changing. So just to, make that clear, we're gonna talk to you about using the information the best that we have right now. And then in terms of our affiliations, it's myself and Dr. Bramall-Phillips who will be doing the presentation. We have a collaborator as well, Dr. Smith-McDonald, who we thank very much for her contributions to this presentation.
Thank you, Alex. So this is Suzette Bramall-Phillips. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute and to join the presentation. Dr. Huber and myself want to identify a couple of different provisos. So as Dr. Huber mentioned, we're working with with the current understanding of the literature as well as our experience in an ever-evolving, changing time, an unprecedented situation that we all find ourselves in. And we just wanted to really put out front that no one can really prepare fully for a pandemic such as this. All of us are learning as we're going along, and everyone is really trying to do their best. Dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic is a marathon, as we've heard, and not a sprint, and things are evolving along that marathon. We're also all in this together and learning about this together. So many of the things that we state, we're very much looking forward to hearing what your input is, what your thoughts are. There are no right and wrong answers. We're going to be presenting some ideas and thoughts about different moral dilemmas that people may face in the course of service. There are other ones that we'd love to hear your perspectives on, knowing that there are going to be numerous different situations that may be tough questions, tricky questions that people need to address. some problems or challenges that people find in the workplace, as well as some moral dilemmas that may surface as a result. So we're going to open up the conversation today, but we also want to just state that we're working with what we have at the moment, and only that amount. We're also going to be looking at a little bit about who you are, and really celebrating your dedication and your service in what you do and how you contribute to the public good. So I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Heber to take over the next few slides, and also to just make an acknowledgement before we do that about the situation in Nova Scotia, and that all of us are very much thinking about what is unfolding, what has unfolded in Nova Scotia, in light of the dedication and commitment of public safety personnel to keep all of us safe. Dr. Heber.
Thank you, and thanks, Suzette, for making that acknowledgement. So we wanted to start out also actually acknowledging something else, which is, I mean, we're going to be talking about some wicked problems and tough decisions and moral dilemmas faced by first responders, public safety personnel. But we wanted to start by really acknowledging that we understand that in many ways you are the masters of dealing with these kinds of problems and making these kinds of tough decisions on the spot, because very often that's what you're doing in your line of work. And so the issue is, though, if you can give me the next slide, that of course the context has now changed. And therefore, for many people, of course, these tough decisions and moral issues are being thrown at us at a very rapid rate. And it can also, the seriousness, I guess, of many of these decisions has increased multifold in terms of what kinds of things are being expected of people on the front lines. And these are, that's to begin with. We will go through what we've identified, some from the research from past pandemics like SARS. Some of the information actually comes from conversations that we've had with public safety personnel working on the front lines right now. So we're going to go through, I think it's 7 or 8 different kind of wicked problems that we've identified, and then we'll discuss these, and we'll then talk about some tips, some ideas of what might be helpful for you. So to go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so, and I think we can go into the next slide actually. These are some of the moral dilemmas that we know that people are facing, that we've heard about. So the first one is failing colleagues. When public safety personnel may become positive for COVID-19 themselves, they need to go into isolation. And this is often very difficult because they feel guilty that their colleagues are having to carry on without them. And often that can be a real dilemma, trying to deal with that and really, you know, suffering while you're at home. The second one, being served versus serving. I think, again, as frontline first responders, we're very good at serving others. That's what our job is all about. That's to a large part of our identity. And sometimes, though, when we're in the position where others want to serve us, that can feel a bit different. And even things like we had an example last week of someone talking about how being in line, waiting for something, waiting to get into a store, and there was a sign at the front saying first responders can come to the front of the line. And this person said, you know, I just don't feel comfortable. I understand that this is a way of honoring what I'm doing, but I don't really feel, it makes me feel a little bit guilty just, you know, being recognized in that way. So that can, I think, sometimes be a bit of a dilemma as well. Next slide. Again, I think because of the work that we do, it's very difficult when we have to work in situations where we have to compromise the service that we provide to the public. And here are a couple of examples. Donning PPE is a barrier that the person I'm trying to help can't see my face, that this can be very difficult. And another one, a big one that we've heard from many people, is that when say paramedics go to a home and somebody needs to go to hospital, that they have to say to the family members, you can't come, you have to stay home now. That can be very, very difficult. Next slide. And then there are the decisions to do with triage and surge capacity. And of course, here is where things can become very critical. And we've heard from many first responders that they feel very uncomfortable and they're very worried about, will they need to be making decisions at some point about who lives and who dies. Next slide. And on the other side of that being honored by the public is that sometimes people are finding themselves being stigmatized because of the fact that they're working on the front line and they are potentially more exposed to COVID-19, that people around them may kind of fear that they're going to be infected by the first responder. And so this is another anxiety, this is another concern or experience that we've heard about from some of our colleagues.
Some further dilemmas that we've heard and we're aware of are about risking one's life. So putting oneself in harm's way for the service of others. And in keeping with that is also the challenge that some individuals, members of the public, may not be attentive to or respectful of some of the orders and guidelines that have been put out by the health authorities. So risking one's life, being there to serve others and to protect people, but people not necessarily bothering to follow the isolation guidelines, and then people being left with some of the anger or the distress or discomfort, challenges of trying to deal with the residual feelings that are associated with that. So that conflict and that dilemma, the internal dilemma of wanting to serve, wanting to do good by people and the public good, but some public not necessarily honoring the risk that people are putting themselves into. Another point would be, another dilemma is putting family at risk. So members who are serving, providing care for others, putting themselves on the line, and also being worried about bringing something home to their families, bringing home the virus, and putting their own families and themselves in harm's way. So both those tensions. The further one is risking colleagues. So if someone were to be infected and to potentially bring the infection, the virus, into one's workplace, especially amidst public safety personnel, where you're providing such an essential service, the thought of risking and infecting another one of your colleagues, especially for those of you who work inadvertently in close contact with other people, can be quite problematic. So feeling the risk of infecting colleagues. A further one that we've been very much alerted to is the need for people to get things right and the pressure to get things right, so that especially those who are triaging or taking the calls in the communication centers, to the pressure of having to make sure that they've gotten the situations right, the vulnerabilities and the risks right, so that they can be prepared for sending people in prepared to handle whatever situation. So if they're not sending people in a prepared way, the burden and the tension that comes with that, the guilt and potentially the shame that might be associated. A final dilemma that we want to bring forward before we open up a little bit of a discussion with our panelists, and to invite all of you who are on the line to think about further dilemmas that might be arising in the context of your work. We just want to name this last one. before opening up the floor, and that's the fear of making a mistake. So what if I make the wrong call? And that too would be associated with the previous slide about what happens if I send people in ill-prepared. A further one would be whether leadership and organizations have your back. So questions about if we do make a mistake, if you do make a mistake, is the organization or the institutions there to support you going forward? So those are some of the moral dilemmas that we want to just start the discussion with. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Robert and to Natalie. We'll start with Robert and see if there are any other additional dilemmas that you might want to identify, just to stimulate the thinking and conversation of those of us who have joined the discussion webinar today. Robert?
I think that public safety communications turns things, sort of the normal tropes on their ear a little bit, specifically when we talk about health workers at risk of contracting COVID and then bringing it home to their family and their friends. You touched on it a little bit, but public safety communications is the opposite direction. So our families need to be extra vigilant. They need to be careful when they go to the shopping, the grocery shopping. They need to be careful if they go out, because if they bring that home and then infect or expose to the public safety communications person, that person then goes to work and has the potential to expose their whole team. And we've seen that in a couple of dispatch centers in Canada already, where one person exposed has COVID and has then made up to 7 people in the center all of a sudden not be able to come to work as well. And that definitely, from a stress perspective, takes its toll on that individual who brought that in. And there's a base level of stress in all of my staff here in Brandon to make sure that they're careful if they go grocery shopping, or they make sure that their spouse or their partner or their family members are careful when they go grocery shopping, to make sure that they're not bringing anything into the center. And this is in an industry that normally comes to work sick. If you've got the sniffles normally, you don't want to let your team down. You need to come into work, in your own opinion, because they're going to run one short if you don't show up, because there's probably not enough staff to get an overtime person in. And if you're sick, they're not going to be full staffed. So you'll come in with the sniffles. And now we're telling people, sorry, you can't come in with the sniffles. So it's even more stressful for them to stay off of work when they know that maybe they just have hay fever, but they can't really define that's what it is. So they have to stay away. Most communication centers are very close quarters. So if one person gets it, the rest of the team is going to get it. And so it's important to keep that out of the center as much as possible.
Thank you for that, Robert. Natalie, do you have any other dilemmas that kind of come front and center for you?
Yeah, I don't know if there are other dilemmas, but I can tell you that we certainly, from a federal correctional perspective, certainly identify with what I see on the slides there. I mean, our folks have a strong desire to serve and to do the right thing, from nurses, correctional officers, parole officers, psychologists, etc. But there's often, with the work that we do, certainly a misunderstanding of what we do by the public. And therefore, if staff are performing their duties, with in mind the duty to serve and the duty to care for others, really to care for other human beings, while sometimes not always agreeing with the guidance, or maybe not understanding the guidance that's provided by leadership, but yet having to sometimes justify to external sources, be it family members or others, what the organization is doing, that can certainly become burdensome for folks. So, I find that we are certainly organizationally dealing with that. The other thing, and certainly alluded to in the presentation, is that our clients are afraid that we'll infect them. And in fact, some of our staff have brought in the virus to some of our institutions. And, what sometimes the public doesn't necessarily understand is that we are going into our clients' homes and bringing this into their home, because essentially they live within the institutional environment. So that becomes, it wears on our staff as well. And they're also then afraid to, sometimes to bring it back to their family. So certainly a lot of challenges that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Natalie, for that. Alex, did you want to offer any other closing comment before we move on to moral injury?
I don't think so. I'll be very interested in seeing what our participants, our audience has to say, and whether they have some other types of situations that they've found particularly difficult. But I don't think I have anything to add right now.
Okay. Well, thank you both for offering those thoughts. We hope that presenting these dilemmas and tough questions that may arise, just naming them, might begin to frame some of the difficult situations that are confronted in the course of service. We're going to go now into a little bit about what moral injury is and what it isn't, and look at morally injurious experiences, and then some different ways that we might want to think about how to prevent potentially engaging in morally injurious experiences, and ways to think through it in advance. So moral injury from the literature is something that's being explored in terms of public safety personnel. We find it more in the literature related to moral distress within the service provision sector, or moral injury within the military and veteran population. Definitionally, it's one of the definitions, and there are a number of them. Moral injury has been defined as a particular syndrome, trauma syndrome, including psychological, existential, behavioral, and interpersonal issues that emerge following perceived violations of deep moral beliefs held by oneself or trusted individuals. They often arise when people are exposed to a morally injurious experience, such as those experiences that we've already identified, and or other ones that we haven't yet identified. So things where there is a conflict that ends up resulting in someone being in a point of tension between what they believe ought to have happened or should happen, and what actually is happening, or having to make choices in the face of particularly troublesome situations where one feels conflicted. And the emotions or the response that one can feel are associated with more of guilt or shame or regret or tension or betrayal, different challenges and struggles that people might have. So moral injury is often described as a struggle, an internal struggle, where there is a clash of values or beliefs of what ought to have done, what ought to be, what one should do, what one has done, and some potential regrets about what one has done or what one hasn't been able to do. So that's an overarching, just simple version of, or a simple definition about what moral injury is, and it's associated, as we've mentioned, with different situations that people might find themselves in. And there are numerous situations, we wouldn't be able to name them all. We're going to shift now into a little bit about what can help in terms of anticipating that these kinds of situations are going to be around everybody during this time of COVID in response to the pandemic. So just being mindful that the struggle and tensions and wicked problems and tricky questions and situations are going to emerge, and they are going to potentially have a residual effect on those who are providing care and service. So we're wanting now to just shift into a little bit about what kinds of things you can do. So I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Heber to start us off with some public spirited behavior.
Thanks, Hazette. Yes, so when we were looking through the literature, and again, lessons learned from past experiences, past pandemics like SARS, there were some lessons that we were able to kind of extract from what we were reading. And there were a group of them that sort of fell under this kind of idea of public spirited behavior or pro-social behavior. And it was interesting because these are things that we can all do, but that also at the same time, they are important elements of helping to decrease the spread of COVID. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these, and then Suzette will address some of the other lessons learned that we found both in the literature and also from, kind of looking at our own personal experience. So the first point I want to make is this about that people in public safety are very important frontline credible voices for the public good. You have very often, though maybe sometimes it doesn't feel like this, you make a big difference, and you will make a big difference when you are communicating with the public. And then here are some points, particular points around kind of helping to decrease the potential of these experiences developing into more long-term stressful events, but also at the same time kind of promoting the public good. So the first one is to practice crisis communication. And especially the points are to make sure that what you communicate is timely, as up to date as possible, is honest and clear. One of the things in past pandemics, sometimes when they looked at the experiences afterwards, what they saw was that governments, institutions felt that they didn't want to panic people. So they felt that they didn't perhaps want to tell people clearly how really threatening the situation was. And because of that, often what happens then is people don't adhere to whatever the rules are that will in fact keep us all safe. So one of the lessons from this is that it's really important to give timely, clear information about the threat, but that with that, it's very important to give people direction or information on what they can do about it. So making people fearful is less effective in changing behavior than if you at the same time tell people, and here's what you can do about it that will help you and it'll help everybody else. So that's the stuff on crisis communication. Fostering strong group identity and cohesion. Well, this is, as we know, social support is one of the most important factors for decreasing the risk of developing more long-term problems, such as post-traumatic disorders. So to foster that strong group cohesion is very important. And again, one way very practically and we know that many frontline workers are doing this, is to check in with colleagues, check in with your leaders. When you have a very tricky situation you've had to deal with, is to go and debrief with somebody and sort of, just have somebody hear what you've been through and perhaps offer some suggestions on other things you might try if there was a place you really got stuck. But it's really about that, making sure that you have support and that you're supporting each other. Using decision trees or algorithms. Again, this really targets that first dilemma or second dilemma, I guess I was talking about, in terms of making life and death decisions. It's very important, if possible, to have this kind of an algorithm to use so that people don't feel that the whole decision is on them, that there is something that has been created based on past experience and evidence, which gives you some guidance in what to do next. And in fact, in Italy, the experience in hospitals in Italy, what they ended up advising was to, in fact, separate the people who were making the decisions, again, decisions around who goes on the ventilator and who doesn't, from the people who were actually delivering the care. That they found that also helped, but that isn't always possible in every situation, we know. Preparedness training. preparation is another one of those very vital components of helping to decrease after effects of these very, very stressful times. And because surprise tends to make that traumatic response more, well, perhaps more long-lasting, but certainly at the time it makes it more acute. So preparedness training, even though really we weren't able to prepare for this pandemic, on an ongoing basis, often again, organizations can hold even short, brief trainings when new information becomes available, and that's really helpful. Reinforcing the public directives when they are ignored. So this again is another important aspect, and it again goes along with this idea of public spirited behavior, that when you find there are maybe members of the public who are not following the directives to keep us all safe, that to talk to them and to think about how you're going to address that with them. And again, in terms of what's effective, it isn't that effective to make people feel guilty or to shame them. But what can be really helpful is to say, you know, I understand why this maybe doesn't make that much sense to you that you need to do this. However, here are the facts. Here's what's going to happen if we don't all, whatever, isolate ourselves. And so empathizing, first of all, saying, I understand why this may seem confusing to you. Secondly, sharing the facts. And then the third really important element is to appeal to their pro-social values. For example, that when you protect yourself and when you maintain social distancing, it's not only you don't only decrease the risk to yourself. Think about the vulnerable people in society, such as the elderly or people with chronic health problems. You're decreasing the risk to them as well. That is a more effective way to help people change their behavior. Leveraging the social media. So here's another way, if you are going on social media, if you want to respond to really kind of, if there's antisocial or stigmatizing posts on social media and you feel you really want to respond, is to think about how you can do that in again, a pro-social way to help, to give people the information that will help them maybe to make a better decision. And also xenophobia I mentioned on here, because it was one of the things that in the research they showed is that when people start making a lot of comments, or in a society there's a lot of xenophobic response, like, you know, saying we don't want foreigners anymore. It's you know, examples around blaming certain countries or certain people, that's a sign that we really need to try and intervene to increase this public spirited approach. And the last point I want to make is about hindsight bias, because as I said in the beginning, when I explained that the information is changing all the time, and what we tell you today, a week from now, perhaps we would give a somewhat different advice, that we're all going to have hindsight bias. And then later on, we may all look back and say, oh, we should have done this faster, we should have done that faster, or we should not have done this. And that's just going to be the reality. But the truth is, right now, we're all only operating on the information we have. And I think everybody's doing a very good job right now of trying to keep everyone in the public updated. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you, Alex. In terms of some other things that we wanted to identify in terms of addressing potential morally injurious experiences. So there's some things related to how we engage with the public, how you engage with the public in order to minimize the likelihood of a morally injurious experience, even presenting, by way of the public being as respectful of your roles and of the directives that are being given, so that the contexts are safer, and the likelihood of morally injurious experiences being arising being reduced. What I'd like to do now is just talk about some ways to specifically think about morally injurious experiences and ways to prepare for them. Some of these overlap with things that Dr. Heber has already mentioned, so just bear in mind what she's already identified. The first one is around girding oneself, preparing, anticipating as much as possible that people are going to be exposed to potentially morally injurious experiences. And so to anticipate them, to anticipate that there's going to be some struggle, and to pre-think through what one's own, what your values are, what your beliefs are, what things you think ought to happen in different situations, where there may be some challenges that might arise, and how those might cause some conflict, and then to pre-think them in terms of what kind of a response one might have in terms of when those experiences might arise. In terms of thinking that through, that's both an individual as well as a collective process. So there are going to be values and beliefs and perspectives that you each individually have, as well as organizationally on your team and otherwise. So just being very aware and being very attentive to and honoring of the values and beliefs that all of you hold. The next is around having regular team discussions. So not just reflecting on it, but also engaging and discussing what potential experiences might arise, what kind of decisions people might need to make, and then follow-ups according if there has been some exposure to a morally injurious experience. So discussing, having some huddles where people are working through, thinking through, processing individually and together. Seeking and expecting guidance from leaders on moral and ethical dilemmas. So looking for guidance once those experiences have been identified or have been thought about or anticipated by teams, individuals, to bring that forward to leadership so that there can be a collective organizational approach to thinking through morally injurious experiences and what people might and ought to do, so that there's some pre-thinking that's going on and some preparation. And this isn't saying that it already hasn't happened. If it is going on, to continue doing that awesomely good work and foresightful and anticipatory work. If it isn't, an invitation and encouragement to start thinking through that and to start naming it and thinking through in advance what people might want to do. Keeping connection and avoiding, sorry about that. Keeping connection and avoiding avoidance. So maintaining relationships and with close friends and close colleagues to make sure that the social component is intact. We know from the literature, we know from experience and from working through trauma with individuals that the importance of relationship and connection is really important. Likewise is avoiding avoidance. If people are avoiding these issues, people are more at risk for developing other conditions related to anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorders, or injuries, as well as moral injury. So wanting to really name those things up front, deal with them up front, and address them where possible. Self-monitoring, thinking through, and this goes back to the first point about girding oneself and preparing as much as possible, doing some self-monitoring and keeping an eye on other colleagues as well. So thinking through how one might experience different situations, scenarios that one might find oneself in, values that might have been compromised, and the personal struggles that might occur. Also keeping a distinction between who one is and what one has done or not done, and the context in perspective about how one has engaged in different scenarios, and making sure that one really grounds in who one really is. The next few I want to just go into are a little bit more in terms of some protective factors. So looking at focusing efforts on what is within your power, what things in the situations and contexts you have control over and can change, and what things one doesn't. So really looking at your own sense of agency and being able to act according to what you believe to be right. Taking short breaks and pacing yourself, engaging in some things like exercise, mindfulness, talking to friends and family, doing some self-care within the process. Fostering some flexible thinking. We know that rigidity in thinking and or emotional dysregulation are very associated with some challenges that people can have related to other mental health challenges associated with being exposed to stressful experiences. So being mindful of being flexible, looking at different options and possibilities, ways that situations can be handled differently. Looking at emotional regulation, practicing some relaxation, stress management skills, engaging in some routines, having opportunities to look at emotions and be able to manage them in a very effective way. And those are skills that if people don't have or want to strengthen, there are ways to do those to enhance emotional regulation. Finally, just seeking assistance when it's needed. So there will be times where people need to reach out, not solely to friends and families and peers, but to other formal supports, so mental health services and EAP, speaking with someone who is a trusted other who you can really discuss at a deep level different experiences that people might have been exposed to. So those are a variety of different kinds of suggestions that we have. We're going to pause at this point and just say thank you, merci à tous, for all essential services and all essential workers who have contributed and who are facing these moral dilemmas, these tricky questions and difficult situations, and doing the absolute best that you can in the context that we all find ourselves in, that you particularly find yourselves in, and having to respond to the needs of our public for the public good. So from Dr. Heber and myself, and also Dr. Smith McDonald and all those who have participated in this presentation, thank you for all that you do. And we're going to open up now the floor to the panelists and to other questions that may have emerged. Emily?
Hi. All right, so we are going to start with some questions here. So I do have just a couple first that I think are more examples, and if the panel wants to be free to comment, they can. The first is from someone who is with the communication services, and she's asking about or wanting to comment on the fact that for her experience is difficult because both she and her husband are first line responders. She's in communications and her husband is a paramedic. And so for them, the dilemmas become twofold because they both are experiencing different versions of this pandemic. And she's wondering how best to approach a situation when you're dealing with it from two ends. Like what advice could be offered when you have a family to take care of, as they do, but they have both of them working these frontline jobs. So Robert, I don't know if you wanted to speak to that just because you are from communications.
I don't know if I have any specific tips or tricks, but this is definitely a problem within emergency services. There's a lot of spouses, a lot of partners that are in either the same, paramedics and paramedics, police and police, or cross services. So I have in my center, I have somebody who works at my communication center, and his spouse works at another communication center in town. So that worry, that cross-contamination worry, is definitely always there, and it builds to that stress. Is it feasible to completely isolate yourself, one in the basement and one upstairs, for months at a time with kids? I don't know that it is. And how do we get around that?
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to say, and thank you for those remarks, Robert, and to the person who sent in the question. I guess the first thing is just to, again, really acknowledge what a tough situation this is for both of you, because if one partner is having a stressful time at a job, often they can count on their partner to be helping them out. But here in this situation now, this has to be really difficult for both of you. What I would say is, for sure, I would say in situations like this, to look at, are there other supports for each of you and both of you? Because you may not be able to be, especially if we're thinking about emotional support, you may not be able to be that kind of emotional support for each other like perhaps you would generally be, in your relationship. Yeah, I guess that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
It's Natalie here. If I could add something as well.
Mm.
So we certainly at corrections, we have a similar dilemma. We have a lot of our staff that work, either within the same institution or in different institutions. So in one of the slides, we spoke about folks that just really didn't want to go to the front of the line to use services that are being offered, et cetera. So, I would certainly encourage the person who asked the question and our own staff to do that. We also are working very closely with our labor partners, and they've been bringing some of these issues to the forefront for us and trying to provide some additional supports or accommodation through either the duty to accommodate program that we have or other means through the employee assistance program, et cetera, some supports there. And so it is very, very challenging. We have a direct access to our national medical advisor, and for some of these more challenging situations, we've been engaging him directly in order to try to provide support to staff directly. So that's what I have to offer.
And for mine, just simply, I wanted to just echo what Dr. Huber has said, and that's that piece of additional social supports, and just really knowing that each person in that household is going to be stressed and not wanting to overburden likely the other. And so really leaning into other colleagues, other friends. And I think that's where that point of having huddles within the workplace, where there's other opportunities to discuss among peers who are very aware of the situations and stressors that are being found in the workplace, the moral dilemmas that are there. So really leaning into one's colleagues and one's other social support, so that entering back into the household with one's partner, you can actually be partners to one another. And I think that type of being able to relate to one another and to lean into other social supports is going to be fairly critical.
Mm-hmm. Actually, can I just add one more thing? This information, we're gathering all of this information. Thank you so much for that example, actually, because we're going to be doing some sessions for leaders. Leadership has actually asked us about doing some sessions specifically for leadership and how they should be working and how they can help their people. And so this is the kind of dilemma. It sounds like it's quite common where you have the two partner people working in first responder in first responder capacities. So we will certainly bring this to those leadership sessions. Thank you.
All right, so we do have another question. Natalie, I'm going to start with you on this, and I'm hoping I'm going to frame it so it's clear. In your organization and in the decision-making trees you provide, do you have mechanisms to address a changing ethical framework? For instance, moving from what would normally be your best practices into other options like greatest good or greatest number of people safe with this situation? Is that something your organization has designed?
I wouldn't say that we have a formal, documented approach or policy to it per se. Within our current framework, I would say loosely through our values and ethics approach is where we would be addressing that. I would say that our current leadership is meeting on a daily basis at the most senior levels of the organization. So I'm talking about commissioner, regional deputy commissioner, senior deputy commissioner, and then that kind of filters down. So a lot of these ethical challenges that are being, brought up either through, and again, through our labor partners, we meet with them 3 times a week to be dealing with some of these issues, are discussed at the most senior level and really worked through in order to provide some guidance and support to staff.
Natalie, Robert, did you want to comment on that question?
I think we're really doing the same thing. We, within Brandon itself, we have an emergency operations center. We opened it very early, and that EOC talks about all of the departments and really specifically the public safety ones. Brandon has their own police service. Brandon has their own fire service. And so we get together on a daily basis and talk about how the staff are being affected, in addition to how the city is being affected. So it's about, for me, it's about communication. It's about making sure that my staff know what's going on, and not just what's going on in the communication center, but what's going on in their bigger world. So within the city of Brandon, for example, what's going on within the city of Brandon? What decisions is Brandon making that may not directly affect them, but secondarily affect them? And for me, it's, and I think this is what it boils down to all the time. It's about communication. It's about keeping your staff informed. And early on in my career, I was told when I became a new manager that staff will always want you to communicate more than you are, regardless of how much you're communicating. You can't give them too much information. So don't keep it secret. We're all in this together, and try to communicate to your staff, let them know what's going on.
And if I could just add something to Robert's point, I think that's very key. You know, so it's also about the approaches, and we mentioned it in this presentation. It's about the different approaches that we use to communicate. Not all staff will resonate with one style of communication. So we really need to have our ear to the ground in terms of what the needs are, in terms of reaching out to folks.
Any follow-up from the presenters?
Alex, do you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
I think it really is about communication, and really keeping people informed, and anticipating again those potential challenges. I think that it begs a really good question in terms of whether there needs to be a consideration of some guidelines to be able to think through who is making these decisions, how they're being made, and to have to offload some of the responsibility of those decisions into a different layer from the service provider. It goes back to what Dr. Heber was talking about in terms of what was found in Italy, to know that the people who were providing the care weren't necessarily the ones who had to think through the difficult ethical decisions and resource allocation that's available, especially in resource limited times. So I think that there's some guidelines or some frameworks that ought to be thought of at a higher level, potentially at a provincial or at a federal level, or a broader level. So there's what can be done on the ground, what can be done at the organizational level and amongst teams, but then there's also the possibility, and I'm not sure on what may be happening on those fronts, where higher level ethical decisions might be being made, or frameworks or guidelines being established. Dr. Heber?
Again, I think I would only add that whatever is going on, whatever information leadership has, it's really important to be passing that down. I think that, Robert really emphasized this well, that you can't give too much information, especially at a time like this. I think you can have, we've been flooded with content recently just in the work we're trying to do. So I think you can get too much information in terms of it's just coming, there's so much of it coming at you. However, I think in terms of that clear, concise information to keep people informed and to let them know what they need to do, you can't give people too much of that.
Okay, so I'm going to go with our last question for today. It's a bit of a comment/question. And it is from someone who is in the fire service. And he indicates that they're used to dealing with irregular incidents in the fire service, but this pandemic is bigger than anything that they've seen in their career. And the question, I guess, would be, once we're past this situation, it's going to be an emotional and difficult times. And it's going to be hard to go back to the way they did things before. Robert, I'll start with you. In your organization, do you guys have a plan for what happens next? What happens after we start to relieve some of the restrictions that we have?
We do, but the restrictions for public safety are so much more stringent than the restrictions on the general public. So the province of Manitoba has just extended their state of emergency by another 30 days. So that means that it'll end somewhere in the end of May. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're all in the same restrictions. It just means that they can then tell us what those restrictions are between now and then. So those restrictions might ease. They won't necessarily ease in my dispatch center because we have to hold this group a little bit to a higher standard to make sure that they stay safe and they stay healthy. I think that when we talk about flattening the curve, you're going to see the curve end farther out for public safety than you're going to see it end for the general public. And so what does that look like? Does that mean that if we're talking about this ending sometime in August, then maybe does that mean that it ends for us in September? Quite possibly it could. I think that this, just like in the regular working atmosphere, I think that this has shown us a lot of things. I think we're going to see from a public safety communications perspective, workstations maybe not being so close together all the time. I think that we're going to see the sanitization and the cleaning procedures be a lot more stringent all the time. We might see people not coming to work when they have the sniffles outside of COVID, like they do now, like I mentioned earlier. We might see people, I mean, there are places, there's Alberta and Calgary right now, they're looking at figuring out a way for call takers and dispatchers to work from home. 3 months ago, that was unheard of. That did not happen for public safety communications. There were too many barriers for that. So we're definitely going to see some changes in public safety communications when this is all said and done. And we're going to see that downward, that denouement, we're going to see that a little bit later for public safety than we will for everybody else.
Robert. Natalie, I know that you're under a bit of a time crunch, so I'm going to let you answer next.
Great, thanks. Completely echo what certainly what Robert is saying. You know, we are starting to think about recovery, but for sure for us, I would say every 2 weeks we're currently reviewing the situation. I mean, we're dealing with, you know, conditions of confinement for other human beings in our organization. You know, big part of the work that we do. So we are continuously reassessing the need to maintain or to loosen the restrictions given the Public Health Agency of Canada guidance, and of course dealing with all of the provincial authorities as well. So we're still into that melee at this point. But also, Robert mentioned, you know, the telework arrangements. Same thing with us, with our headquarters staff and some of our local staff, where, you know, we've increased our bandwidth in order to support the work from home, which we really were not in a position to do in the past. But this pandemic has really pushed us in that direction. So there will be a number of issues to deal with, you know, from staff, from that perspective. And I would say also from a post-traumatic stress injury perspective as well, although we haven't really seen any workers' compensation claims come our way. We know that there are some, you know, this is a very stressful time for many folks and their families, and we're anticipating that we're going to be dealing with those pieces, recovery of those individuals, and support for return to work, you know, eventually. So that's what I have to offer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I know you do have to go now, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you.
Turn it back over to the presenters if you want any final thoughts to that comment about where do we go from here. And we can finish up.
After you, Alex.
Sure. Okay. Just that I think, yeah, so many people right now, they've just still got their heads down trying to get through things and you know, have so much coming at them. I really appreciate the comment from the firefighter about how, you know, no matter what they've had to deal with before, this is different. And I agree as well with him or her that when we get to the end of it, I think things will have changed, and that may also create some great opportunities for rethinking how we do things and also how we take care of each other, because I agree we're going to have to see, you know, sort of in the aftermath, how are people coping with, struggling with, or overcoming some of these very, very difficult, stressful situations they've been through. And I just want to, again, add a bit of a plug for the Thursday, the part 2 of the moral injury presentation on Thursday, which will actually focus a bit more on that aspect.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to echo that. Thank you, Dr. Heber. I think from my end, the question around what happens after and how do we prepare, how do we take care of, how do we respond once people are able to be in a spot to decompress and reflect on what they've lived through. And that will be a different season. I almost don't want to encourage people to go there too quickly and just anticipate that people are thinking about ways to take care, ways to provide service and supports to help people who have gone through various different kinds of traumatic experiences to help them get back on track and to return to work and to a semblance of normalcy thereafter. So I would plug Thursday's presentation that will go into some of the assessments and interventions of what we know now can be supportive, but know that many people are giving some very dedicated thought, specific thought to how do we support people in the aftermath of this to deal with these morally injurious experiences, moral dilemmas, post-traumatic stress, anxieties, depressions that might arise as a result of it. So right now we want to encourage everyone to be strong, to take heart, and to do the work that you do so well, to continue doing that with your teams, with others, to lean into one another, to support each other in the process, to reach out and get the supports that you need from your communities and from one another, and to know that we are wanting to support you in whatever way we possibly can, and we'll cultivate and encourage supports to be developed so that there is something there that is substantive and supportive of you during these times and after. Alex, you get the final word.
I don't really have anything to add to that. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for joining us today.
Perfect. So I have put back up on the screen just quickly our disclaimer, just to remind people that this presentation does reflect the current knowledge that we're having. Also, I just want to let people know that there is a town hall on Thursday. So please, if you haven't already signed up, please do sign up. And you will be getting a survey to complete tomorrow with your follow-up email. As well, you will also get a video of the webinar that you saw today with your follow-up email. If you still have questions and would like us to provide you answers, please go ahead and submit that to the email address provided. That's our COVID-19 at CIPSRT-ICRTPSP.ca. So please go ahead and send that there. Again, I want to thank our presenters today, and I want to thank our panelists today for giving their time to this presentation. And as they are saying, we may be apart, but we are in this together. So thank you, everybody. Take care and stay safe.